ask the question. Okay, over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, so first of all, feel free to unmute yourself. I will try to see if I can monitor if anyone like does anything else, like raises a hand or something like that. But unmuting yourself is the safest way to ask a question. And I welcome interruptions throughout so that we can all stay on the same page and sort of have a discussion while I go through this. So this is joint work with Christy Buzard, who's over at Syracuse University, and Ola Stoddard, who's at Brigham Young University. Title of the paper is Who Are You Going to Call? And I think we've already alluded to why it's called that. It has to do with calling parents as a measurement, though, of gender inequality in the demand for parental involvement. So, I'll kind of jump right in to the motivation for why you might care about that. Right. So, despite the convergence of men and women's roles, sorry. So despite the convergence of men and women's roles in the labor market, we still know that there's this earnings gap that remains, right? And I'm of course not the first person to talk about that. An important contribution to that earnings gap is this thing that women tend to concentrate in these more flexible jobs, okay? And this has been, documented by many different people. This is just a slight, listing of some of the more recent work. Furthermore, it's not really just women overall, it's women who are mothers of children, where this is specifically true that they are concentrating in these more flexible jobs, and that's contributing to their earnings gap between them and men. So, to sort of think about why we might need this workplace flexibility, why do these mothers tend to need more workplace flexibility than their male father counterparts, we could look at data from, time use surveys. So here, what I have here is a graph of data from the American Time Use Survey from 2015 to 2019. I'm looking at households where there's a married couple cohabitating. They both work full time. They have one male and one female partner, and they have children under the age of 18 living in the household. And what I've done here is I have basically on the vertical axis is the proportion of time in that household spent on an activity. And on the horizontal axis are all, a bevy of different activities that one might engage in, starting on the left-hand side with lawn and garden care, the next one being work, and so on and so forth. And then on the far right-hand side, going all the way over to housework. And the orange bars are the proportion of time that the mother spends on that in that household. And the blue bar is the proportion of time that fathers spend in that household. So if you look like maybe kind of right in the middle, you can see that for personal care / sleep, the orange and the blue bars are right at the 50-50 mark, meaning that mothers and fathers both sleep about the same amount of time in their households, okay? Which is nice. And if you're curious how much they're sleeping, you could look at the top of the bar and see that the number of hours that a household would spend in one day is 17.89 on average. That means that that about half of that time is the father's sleep and about half of that time is the mother's sleep. Okay, so that's how you're going to read this figure here. Now, what am I trying to tell you with this figure, now that I've explained it, is there's a line at the 50-50 mark, and anything where the orange lines are below the 50-50 mark or something that a father's doing more of, anything where the orange lines are above the 50-50 mark are things that mothers are doing more of. And so you can see that the things that fathers are doing more of are on the far left-hand side there, lawn and garden care. They do slightly more work than mothers do. Work outside the home is what I mean here, or work from home, but work in general, although this is 2015 to 2019, so probably work outside the home mostly. They do slightly more leisure and sports. They do about an equal amount of playing and doing hobbies with children. Like I said, they do equal sleep. And then as you go further out to the right, you can see that there's the word children shows up in pretty much all of this, that women are doing more of the stuff that has to do with children. So travel related to children, physical care of children, food preparation and cleanup, and housework, okay? So what I'm trying to get at here is this idea that maybe one of the reasons that women are flexible, are sorting into these flexible jobs is because they're doing more of the child-related tasks in their household, okay? And I should take a moment to pause here to say that I'm going to be concentrating in this talk about male and female households. Of course, there are different types of genders and different types of households. Those are just outside the scope of today's talk. But I think that that's an area for future research to think about. We're going to concentrate on sort of the extremes of gender, male and female, and households that have one of each of those people in them. So, okay. Going on more about this idea of like a need place for workplace flexibility, the time use data kind of gives you this idea from a very, sort of macro perspective of how households are spending their time. But you don't really get an idea of like why they've chosen to spend their time that way. So we ran a small survey of about 349 people. Again, this is just people who identify as mothers and fathers. It's about 47% mothers, and the remaining 53% were fathers. And we asked them why they maybe asked for a more flexible job, right? Or, and we asked them questions like, did child-related interruptions have led me to choose either like a more flexible job, a shorter commute, to be a stay-at-home parent, and so on and so forth. So lots of different sort of ideas of like things that a parent might do in response to having interruptions because they have children during their workday. Okay. And throughout this presentation, orange bars are going to be for mothers, blue bars are going to be for fathers. And what I want you to take away from this graph is the idea that the orange bars are always taller than the blue bars. So that, yes, both male and female parents say they take more flexible jobs because they might get interrupted by their child. However, mothers do that much more, say that they do that more often than fathers do. They also say that they take jobs with a shorter commute and became a stay-at-home parent and took a job with lower pay and so on and so forth. Some things they don't do is they don't choose a different college major, for instance, right on the far right-hand side of that. Okay. Or well, they do actually, but very small differences there.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah,
sorry.
Go for it.
So when I look at the 349, so most of them are couples?
So these are not couples. So we did this on a survey platform. And so these are just people who are part of a couple, but these are not, we're not guaranteeing to have the same members of both sides of the couple.
But just to get a rough estimate, how many do you think are couples in this 349?
Oh, everyone here is supposed to be in a 2-parent household with
when
one
I say
male
couple,
and one female parent.
I mean physically living in the same household.
So these people are not necessarily couples at all. Yeah,
okay.
So,
Thank you.
I think that would be interesting to know, but these are just more like I'm going to get some men and some women, all of which are part of some couple, but they're not part of the same couple necessarily.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem. Good clarifying
Laura,
question.
can I ask a question on the previous slide? When
sure.
So I'm actually surprised by the low total time spent on the right bars when women take, more of the share, that it's only like, spend an hour on each. Are you getting pushback on that? That, okay, so they do more, but it's minimal?
Sure. So that I think is a really good question. And that is something I've gotten pushback on. So first of all, let me just say that this is data for every day of the week. So it includes both weekends and weekdays. So, if you did weekends, this might look different than weekdays. If you did summer, you might look different than whatever. But totally right. You might think, okay, women are spending a lot more time on reading or on education related activities with children, but only 0.08 hours per day in a household is spent on that. So does that really matter? Right. And I think that my response to that is that indeed, I think, that spending, if I have to spend 0.06 hours on something, you have to spend 0.02, that's probably not going to change our career trajectories, all that much. However, I think that this slide sort of gives this idea that because I know I'm going to spend more time on this, even though it might be small amounts of time, that I might be making bigger decisions about my career trajectory that are going to change and lead to an earnings gap. So even though the hours that I spend doing these things, and especially I would say interruptions that are unexpected, right? So if I know I have to pick up my kid, that's one thing. If I get a call from the kid's doctor or, get the call from the kid's school saying they need to, they're sick, that's actually it may not take up that much time in the full year, but it's certainly going to change the way that I structure my career because I know that I'm the first line of defense for all those unexpected interruptions. So that's what I would kind of say to that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Other questions right now? This is a great time to, if you want to jump in, go for it. But yeah, and so I think we think of this paper as sort of a proof of concept idea here that we know that there's this earnings gap. We know lots of things that contribute to it. Something that I don't think we've seen a lot of data or discussion on yet is this idea that maybe a household individually could say, we want to split things 50-50, but it might be very hard for them to do that because there's some external forces pushing them towards not being able to make that 50-50 split happen. And so right now what I'm motivating with is stuff that has nothing to do with an internal household bargaining thing here. I'm just saying that, moms seem to be doing more of this. And we're going to say, okay, maybe one reason is because all the systems that moms and dads interact with default to calling moms first. Okay, so what are the consequences of, this kind of interest in workplace flexibility.
Sorry,
Oh yeah, go for it.
May I ask
Yep.
a question? It's related to the question that Eva had. But this slide or these data refer to working women. Yeah. So,
Yes.
I mean, the situation would be completely different if some of the women are not working. And perhaps the reason they're not working is because that there is too much housework to do. Here you have decided you want to work and you have outsourced the housework to somebody else.
Yeah, and so this slide here, the ATUS one is all working women. You're right. This one is actually just people who identify as mothers and fathers, and you can see some of them said they became a stay-at-home parent in response to child-related interruptions. But you're totally right that this one is all parents who are working currently, and that the allocation would look very different if you looked at all parents. Right. And I think that a lot of these orange bars would get much taller if you looked at all parents, including stay-at-home parents.
I actually will piggyback on Daphne, because what if this time, small time spent on some of these things that I'm surprised by is because you're paying somebody else to do it for you, right?
Oh, it's entirely possible.
That might
yeah, this could definitely be due to outsourcing of cooking and cleaning, which I do in my household.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the consequences of this workplace flexibility, even for mothers who work, ostensibly working full time and fathers who are working full time? Okay, so, here we have data on time use and we have data on wages. I'll look at the US context here and follow what Cubis, June, and Silas did in 2021. They look at basically the correlation, so this is not causational, but correlation between interruptions during the workday from time use data and wages, just so. And what they find here is that they find, first of all, just sort of factually, that 35% of mothers say they experience a household interruption during their workday, versus only 20% of fathers experience some sort of household interruption during a workday. Okay, so that is happening. Mothers are getting interrupted more often than fathers by household stuff. Furthermore, they link that to wages data, and they find that any interruptions associated, so not caused by, but associated with, a 9% decline in wages for men. So that's what they do, and this is a AER papers and proceedings. So it's a very short paper. It doesn't have a whole ton of details. So what we did was we just kind of replicated what they did. And we were thinking about not only the extensive margin of did you get interrupted, but how often were you interrupted? How many minutes were you spending on this? And this is to Ava's point, maybe these are small amounts of time, but what are they associated with in terms of wage differences? And what we find is that mothers shoulder about 58% of the hours of interruptions in a household on any given day, with fathers shouldering about the remaining 42%. Okay, so the calculations are the same style as their paper. And then we can, once again, correlate that with how much does an extra hour of household interruption during the workday associated with a decline in wages. We do that for both men and women together, and we find that an extra hour of household interruption during a workday is associated with a 3.4% decline in wages. So I would argue that's actually pretty big, even though you may not get an hour of interruption every day. If you think about it over time, it might be quite a hit to you. Some other stuff to keep in mind, real work outside of what we have done and this sort of correlational stuff. There's this nice paper by Abby Adams-Purcell and co-authors that shows that women earn less than men on similar online tasks. And that the reason that they're earning less is because they're getting interrupted by their children more often. So, you might be worried that all this is about sorting to different types of, jobs. But in Abby's paper, they're doing the exact same type of job, but women are just earning less because they're getting interrupted more often, right? So it's not necessarily all about sorting into different types of jobs. So you could imagine that this could, even though these are small amounts of time and they don't happen every single day, you could imagine it could have substantial implications for labor market, human capital, and also mental health, like health outcomes for these households and women specifically. And so what we wanted to do here is say, okay, knowing all that to be true, some of this inequality might be driven by external things to the household. So not like the household has bargained internally to say, oh, you're the woman, you're going to do more of this, and I'm the man, and I'm going to do less of this. Maybe the household has said, you're the man and you're going to be a stay-at-home parent and do all of this, but that might be hard to implement in the real world because institutions expect the female to be the default parent. So what are we going to do? We're going to kind of investigate this previously unexplored source of inequality, these external demands, external to the household, from current institutions and systems. So descriptively, what are we going to do? We're going to just ask the question, are mothers more likely to be contacted about child-related tasks? So note, you could look at observational data here. Like I could go to a school, my husband's a high school teacher. I could go to his school and say, can you tell me, you know, how often is the mom listed as the primary contact, or how often have you called the mom versus the dad for nurse things? The problem with that would be I, would be getting all this from households where the household has selected into one person being the primary versus non-primary contact. So observational data would not really tell me what would happen if there was no signal about which parent wanted to be called more often, right? And so the nice thing about running an experiment here is I can, by design, send out messages with no signal about which parent wants to be contacted and see if there's still inequality in that setting. Okay, so that's why we're running an experiment, is because otherwise we just aren't able to understand if it's signaling from the household that's making this happen versus the external decision maker sort of having a bias towards calling moms. Now, what else are we going to do to try to get at the mechanism for why an external decision might have a bias towards calling a mother or a father? Kind of when I first started on this project, the sort of classical thing that came to mind is this idea that on average in the US and in other settings, mothers are more likely to be stay-at-home parents than fathers are. If I, as a decision maker, want to contact someone in your household and I don't know anything about your household, it actually makes perfect sense for me to call the mother first, right? I don't know anything. She's more likely to be a stay-at-home parent. I'll call her first. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to get at how much of this is coming from a mechanism of beliefs that mothers are more responsive or available. And we're going to do that by sending different signals to different decision makers, and then using a kind of simple model to back out how much of this is driven by these beliefs about responsiveness and availability, and how much of it is driven by non-responsive deterrents like taste. Okay. So we'll develop a theoretical model to inform an 80,000 persons field experiment. And now I'll just show you what the field experiment's going to look like. Okay. And to be honest, the co-authorship here is I am not the theorist, so I will spend more time on the field experiment and less time on the theory. If you had Christy here, that would be reversed. So here's what the experiment looks like. We pose as a 2-parent household. In this example that I've shown you here, it's a household where I've got Roy, which is a male presenting name, and I've got Erica, which is a female presenting name. And we send an email to a principal, dear Principal G, we are searching for schools for our child. Can you call one of us to discuss? And then we give the principal 2 phone numbers, the male phone number and the female phone number. We randomize whether or not the male one comes first or the female one comes first, and those are all balanced in the design, okay? Sometimes we send them one that also has this highlighted sentence that says, this is the type of decision we both want to be involved equally. So in that when we put that sentence in there, we're just trying to show the decision maker that even though you might have some beliefs about, one of us being maybe more available, that we really want you to know that even though maybe one of us has more time, that we're both really interested in responsive to this idea of talking about this. All right. So on the left-hand side here, I actually have 2 different emails represented, right? There's the one with the message in the highlight, and there's the one without. And of course, there's actually versions of this where Erica's name is first and versions where Roy's name is first. That's going to get me that sort of baseline inequality. That's going to say we have no signal about whether Roy or Erica is more available, and we're going to just find out if they call back Erica more often. Okay. Then to get at the mechanism for why there might be inequality when there is no signal about who is more available, we send out these other email messages that are on the right-hand side. So we add in a sentence that says something along the lines of, I have a lot of, or I have limited availability to chat, but you can call me or my spouse, okay? And we do that both for Erica being the first listed parent or Roy being the first listed parent. And once again, we also sometimes put in these highlighted messages saying that this is the type of decision we both want to be involved in equally. So what do I have represented on this simple, picture is I actually have 10 different emails represented in front of you right now. But I'm trying to make it as easy as possible to comprehend all the different variations of them. So let me pause here for a second and take questions about just like what's happening in the different messages and their reasons for existing.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So the expectation is that they would call rather than respond by email?
Good question. So they do sometimes respond by email. And we have it set up so that there is a auto response to the email that says that we don't monitor this very well. Can you please call us back? And we have had we've tracked down who emailed us and then linked it to whether or not they called us. And most of them do actually end up calling us because of that auto response that happens.
Okay, great. The only reason I'm saying is because I see the spouses, whatever, email only for the right top panel, but I don't see the like CC. So I was just wondering whether they would respond directly to the person who sent it. Okay, got it.
Yes, and then to that end, I should say we also so they do CC the other parents. So you can see like in these ones that on the far left, Roy is the one who sent the email, but he CC'd Erica.
Oh, okay.
So they can respond to all, and that's usually what they do. And of course, we want to force them not to do that because we're trying to say like, oh, if you had to choose one or the other, because often you do have to choose one or the other as the person to contact for like a sick child or something, you know, which one would they choose? Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Laura, may I ask, are principals mainly women or men?
Good question. So it depends on grade level. So overall, principals are actually about, I'm trying to remember, it's like a 60-40 split, and I don't remember which one. I think it's 60% male and 40% female. But it's split differentially by grade level. So for grade school, it's more likely to be female principals, and for high school, secondary school, and stuff like that, it's more likely to be male. And we did pre-register a hypothesis that there might be some interaction between the gender of the principal and the size of the sort of inequality. We didn't actually see much on that, but your intuition was my intuition on that.
Can I ask something, Laura? So in this case, you're sending an email about choosing a school. So I mean, quote unquote, this may be considered a big decision. What about you were sending an email just to the nurse though, and it's just about the medication of the child? Do you think you may get a different response?
Yes. So I think that the inequality we're going to see here in some sense might be a little bit of a lower bound on the inequality in the school setting, because I think this is actually a pretty neutral question that one might be asking of a school setting. But if it was something about, let's say, health or, you know, behavioral issues, it might code more female. And we do have a little survey evidence to that, so I can show you that in a few slides. We do actually have a version where we sent out one where we added in a sentence saying we want to talk about fees, which we thought coded as more male, like, oh, you know, and there we found the results were very similar. So I was kind of surprised because I thought that maybe there'd be more leaning towards calling fathers when we're talking about fees, but that was not the case. Vijata, I'm sorry if I pronounce, please tell me how to pronounce your name.
Vijeta.
Thank you.
Actually, Alfredo just asked the question that I wanted to ask. So thank you for
that. Great. And in the chat, I see that people asked if I mentioned the age of the child. We did not mention the age of the child. I imagine there could be something about that, but we did not look into that. And we do not know the ages of the principals. We actually kind of wanted to figure out how to find out the age of the principal. We do have their name. So in theory, we could go and like maybe look up their name in some sort of database and find out when they graduated from college. We haven't done that yet, but I do think that, as Elena pointed out, there might be something about the idea that maybe an older principal might have more traditional gender norms, and you might expect that they would have maybe a larger inequality between calling men and women. That's sort of on our list of like, if we had infinite resources to look up the age of these people, we might know the answer to that.
This slightly related to that. Was it always the principal who called back?
Nope. Okay. So quite often, so especially for schools, so this data set that we have is there's about 100,000 principals in the US. And you know, that's both public schools, private schools, and what we have are called charter schools here. So public schools are funded by the state. Private schools are privately owned and often parochial, like Catholic, Jewish, etc. And then there was the charter schools are sort of this middle area where it's funded by the state, but it's has its own set of rules. And I lost the track of what I was saying. What is your question again?
The reason I was asking the question was kind of following up from what Daphne asked, because the principal, whatever their gender might be, they can forward the email to an administrator who's
And so the reason I brought up this public versus private thing is that private schools, where people have to pay tuition, and there's like a sort of admission, there's often an admissions person there. And so at private schools, we found quite often that we weren't getting called back by the principal, we were getting called back by the admissions director at the private school. There is a gender thing there too. Like, principals are more likely, generally speaking, in the small amount of coding that we did on this, it looked like the principals were more likely to be male and to pass it off to a female assistant. But that at the end there is too small to really like dig into, is that a differential in terms of the inequality that we're seeing? Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? These are all really good. One other thing I will say is that also, no one brought this up, but I'll bring it up since we're talking about this. Sometimes they texted our parents also, so they text both of them at the same time, and that also has an auto reply. So much like if you email both the parents at the same time, if you text both of them, it says, this is like a landline, please don't text us on this. And so that's how we get around them trying to contact both parents at once, which, some of them want to, although I will say not, we didn't get a ton, and it wasn't like everyone tried to email us back or everyone tried to text us instead. Okay. So preview of results, just so we can get to that. When there's no signal about who to call, then mothers are called about 1.4 times more often than fathers. Okay. Now, why is that happening? That inequality, if you believe the model I'm about to show you, which of course I haven't shown you yet, so you don't know how much to believe it. But if you did, you would find that the inequality is driven partially about beliefs about parents' responsiveness. About half of it seems to be from that. But the other half seems to come from just other things. And we'll talk more about what maybe they think those other things are, but it's not that this is all driven by principals' beliefs that mothers are more available. Okay. So let me give you. Go ahead, Klaus.
Sorry,
yeah, please. Yeah.
I have a question. Is there a difference in the speed of response?
So that we have not dug into a bunch so far. That's also on our punch list of things to do. What we do find in general is like if they're going to call us back, they're going to call us back within a week of getting the email. Otherwise, we never hear from them. so after about a week, you get all the phone calls. I don't remember. So yeah, we haven't done anything about like, do they call back moms more quickly than do they call back others?
That's what I had in mind also.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of the quality of the response is also a matter of how serious am I taking you? Yes, and this. If I call back within a day or two, it's different than when I call you back in 10 days. Yes, I mean.
Yep. And something else we did code, which we haven't gotten much into because we just didn't on our first sort of cut of the summary stats, didn't see a ton on it, is the time of day that they called them back to, because you could imagine maybe they think fathers are working, so I'll call them back during lunch hour or something, trying to catch them when they might not be in the middle of a job or something like that. We didn't see much on it, but yeah.
You actually have
Laura, may I ask?
Sorry. Go Eva first, and then
sorry,
Daphne.
Eva, go ahead.
Eva, go ahead.
Sorry, did you actually have somebody answering the phones or just
no?
a
We have it's a
voicemail?
voicemail that picks it up. Yeah. Daphne, go ahead.
I wanted to ask: is it common to ask for this kind of information through email?
Good question.
People be puzzled about.
Yes. So we surveyed a bunch of educators before we ran this experiment, and I can show you some of that a little bit later, but top level to answer your question is the answer is no, this is not atypical at all. It's quite common. Most of these emails tend to come over the summertime here because school enrolls in August and September. So the most common time for this type of email to come through is in like May, June, July. And the educators that we, surveyed about this said this is, this would not be surprising to them to get a message like this. Yes, even though in the US, public school is often done by location. So it's not like you have you don't always have a ton of choice about, where you're going to go once you've located somewhere, but people often make that decision at the same time. Like they say, oh, I want to move to this city, but I want to where within the city I want to move might depend on different schools that are available in different parts of the city.
Yeah, I was thinking more that they would expect the parent to call rather than to email.
Yeah, I don't know. We actually, I do know that. We surveyed them and we asked them, how often do you get calls like this? How often do you get emails like this? And if I recall correctly, and I think I actually have this in a slide later, the rates are very similar. They said both of them are very common and that it's very slightly more often that they get emails of this type versus phone calls. Yeah. All right, so let me get into the theory sketch. So this is really just to sort of to think about how our decision makers are making choices, and then we're going to use that to try to say, well, is this inequality driven by beliefs about how responsive mothers versus fathers are going to be? Okay, so we have a decision maker indexed I who compares utility from different options indexed J of who to call. Okay, so they can either call the female parents first when J is equal to F, they can call the male parent first when J is equal to M, or they can call neither parent. That is an option. Okay, and so their utility is just, you know, the utility of action for person I from action J is just going to be their expectation of benefit of response from calling parent J. We put this in as multiplied by the desire for equal decision making by parent J and their partner. You could instead, you know, put this in a different functional form. This is just simply an easier way to put it in here right now. Okay, it will generalize. Plus some utility from just replying to the person who sent you the email, because we do find that quite often people prefer to just call the first number they see, right? Which makes sense. It's a default. Minus some cost of calling. You'll notice that the cost of calling is the same for calling mom versus dad. There's no J index on there because calling someone should be equally costly regardless of which person you're calling. And then minus some other deterrence, which does vary by which parent you're calling. That might be something like you have a preference for calling moms or a taste for calling dads, you know, and this is just a very simple model, okay? And so we're going to assume no benefit or cost of calling when you don't call either parent. That's just going to be a normalization. Once again, that could generalize if you didn't want to do that. So we have this utility function we're thinking our decision maker has in front of them. Then they're going to either decide to make no call, right? If the utility from both of them is very low, call the female parent when that's the higher level of utility, call the male parent when that's the higher level of utility. Pretty simple. Without signals, the decision maker is going to have these like baseline beliefs of responsiveness for both female and male parents. So we're going to back that out. And then through the field experiment, we're going to be able to obtain population level estimates of basically the gap between the beliefs of how responsive the male or female parent is. So that's that Q times R F minus Q times RM. Okay, if that's greater than 0, that means that they think female parents are going to be more responsive. Okay, and then we're also going to be able to back out what is the difference between deterrence, these other deterrents that don't have to do with responsiveness, for calling male versus female parents. Our hypothesis is that that's more of a taste for calling female parents. So I put this in as delta M minus delta F. If that's greater than 0, that means that there's basically more taste for calling mothers or a distaste for calling fathers. Okay. So, you know, I'm going to wave my hands through this because I'm not the theorist in the collaboration. But we have this theory-informed field experiment that we're going to use to try to back out how much of our inequality is driven by these beliefs about responsiveness and these beliefs about, you know, taste basically for calling mothers versus fathers. Okay, so we're going to send 2 signals of responsiveness with known cardinal values about each parent, with and without setting beliefs about equal decision making. And that's going to lead to 5 experimental treatments plus the versions with the equal decision making on there. So there's going to be 10 treatments in total, which is what I showed you earlier. Okay, so let me get into the results from the field experiment. Okay. First, let me just say, and this is to an earlier question before I get into the results from our specific place. So we're looking at this in schools, and we're looking at this for schools where we're asking them a question about, just tell us about your school. We did survey a bunch of decision makers who interact with parents. So school is one place the parents interact with decision makers, but they also interact with religious leaders, sports leaders, law enforcement, tutors, family members, you know, medical and dental persons, extracurricular leaders, school-related, and childcare providers is sort of the broad spectrum of people we talked to. So we had a survey of about 300 people who identify as one of these types of decision makers who interacts with parents. We asked them simply a question along the lines of, what's the proportion of time that you contact the father versus the mother first, if only contacting one parent? And what you can see here is that even though we're looking at the school setting, which is on the far right over here, and you can see that these decision makers self-report that they call mothers around 75% of the time here. I think if we were to run this experiment with, let's say, dentists or doctors or even religious leaders, we'd still see this preference for calling moms more than dads. So, you know, we only ran this in one setting, but there's evidence that people self-report that they would be more likely to call mothers. And furthermore, there's other work that looks at observational data showing that indeed mothers are more likely to be the ones who interact with doctor's visits, sick days, etc. Okay. Also, school is really widespread in the US. 40% of US households have a school-age child, and the gender gap, back when I showed you the American time use data in the very beginning, in school-related stuff is also similar to the other child-related gaps that we saw. Okay, so now with that aside, just decided to say like external validity-wise, even though I'm showing you just for principles, you might imagine it would be similar for doctors, dentists, religious leaders, etc. Let's think of, what else we have out there. So this is a proof of concept in external for gender gaps and external demands. Keep in mind that many of those are actually non-repeated interactions. So it's hard for, maybe the receptionist at your doctor or at your school, or for a law enforcement officer, so you're hopefully not interacting too often with them, to know, like, maybe I called the wrong parent first this time, but I'll correct it next time, right? Many of these are simply like a one-time interaction, or very few. So some of the demands, though, are repeated interactions, and the school might be one of those places you'd think you'd have the most repeated interactions. So, we did do a survey of parents asking them essentially, like, if you tell the school who to call, how do you communicate that? So parents state having to engage in stating their preference for who to contact about 1.8 times per year for a school and 2.8 times a year for all organizations. Moms say they do this more often than dads, so they're the ones who are like communicating who should be called in a household. Parents report 25% of schools and organizations are unable to consistently honor their household preferences. So even if you're able to signal who you want to call, it doesn't always get implemented by these decision makers. Furthermore, if you tell them to call somebody and they call the wrong person, you might have to you might be able to just outsource that, right? So like, let's say I'm a mother, I've said you should call the father. They call me anyway. Well, I can, obviously just call the father up and be like, hey, they called me. Can you deal with this? It looks like mothers have to do that more often than fathers. So mothers are unable to outsource this as often as fathers are. So mothers outsource their demands less than fathers do. So if they get a call, they just deal with it themselves. They also find that it takes more time to outsource these things than fathers do. And they report, twice as many mothers report outsourcing to a partner as disruptive versus fathers doesn't seem very disruptive to their day to outsource to their wife. Only 42% of mothers can outsource to a partner without further intervention. So the idea here being that, like, maybe, one gets a call that their child needs to get picked up. Mom calls the dad and says, oh, can you go pick them up? And the dad says, oh yeah, I definitely can. But then he's like, but where do I have to go? And who do I talk to? And all these other things. So this is just to say that, like, to I think Eva's earlier point, these might be small interruptions, but they could be very costly, and they might be more costly to mothers than fathers when they do come up. Okay, so we're going to show gender inequality in one example, but I think it's true in other settings, and I think that it might even be more costly to mothers than fathers in a variety of settings. So once again, just reminding you of what our 10 emails look like. And then I'll try finally show you what happens, right? So results. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about who we got these sent out to. We sent these out to 80,071 principals in the US. There's 5 baseline messages. There's 5 with that yellow bar, equal decision messages. We sent about 30,000 to each of those, okay? And then there's going to be a few other ones that we're going to run as robustness checks, so I'll just kind of highlight those right now. So there's other variations. One is we add in a sentence saying that we both work full-time. And I can show you the results from that, but they look very similar. Another one is that we tell them, we tried to choose a more male domain. So we added in a sentence saying we're especially interested in discussing school fees and other expenses. Once again, we expected that to actually skew more towards male calling, but it didn't actually end up doing so. And I can show you the results from that later. So let's see, what else to tell you about this? 1/5 of principals actually call us back. We're going to focus on the first call, but we do actually have data about all the calls that come in, and we can talk about that more as we go through if you want. But the first call trends look very similar to the all call trends. Okay, so no calls. First off, okay, so I have 10 green bars here. These green bars represent how many principals did not call us back, okay? So there's 10 different messages. Over all of my different messages, the callback rate is about the same. right? Only 21% of principals call us back. That is true when I send a message with no signal about which parent is going to be more responsive. That's true when I send messages that say that the male parent has high availability. It's also true when I send messages about the female parent having high availability. There is some selection into who calls, okay? And that selection is, you know, kind of the way you would think, like private schools are more likely to call you back than public schools. But none of this is statistically significant, these differences across these green bars. So I'm going to concentrate on showing you, and this is true for all of the different variations. So I'm going to concentrate on just showing you calls to moms versus calls to dads instead of showing you the no callback rate, okay? So what do we find descriptively? Is there an external gender gap? Yes, there is. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, I have the baseline messages. Those are the ones without the highlight. On the right-hand side, I have the one with the highlighted sentence saying we both like to be equal decision makers. You can see it doesn't really make much of a difference when you add in that extra sentence. What do we find? Female parents get about 12% of the calls. Male parents get about 8% of the calls. And then remember, 8 plus 12 is 20. That's the 20% of calls that we got. The rest of the 80% is non-call, okay? This is all statistically significantly different from each other. So now I'm going to show you how sending messages about who is more or less available might change the allocation of calls to moms versus dads. To do that, let's first concentrate on basically the version with no signal. So in the center here is the no signal messages. So no signal about mom or dad being more available. The orange bars are around the 60% mark, saying that conditional on a call being made to a parent, 60% of the calls go to the mother, remaining 40% go to the father, okay? And so the question here is, do our messages change anything, right? And so let me show you. Indeed, they do, okay? And they work in the way you expect them to, insofar as on the far left-hand side here, when we have men saying that they have high availability, you can see that the blue bars get really long, right? But still about 25% of calls go to mothers, okay? And then on the far right-hand side, when the female parent says she has high availability, the orange bars get really tall, and about 90% of calls go to mothers here, okay? Any questions about just this while I have it up here?
This already nets out the randomization of who you listed first, who sent the
exactly.
email, right?
So this is balanced on both those things. Yep. Mm-hmm. All right, so you know what you can see here is it's pretty easy to push all the calls to mom by saying she's highly available. You get 90% of the calls to moms. It's more difficult to push all the calls to dad because when you say dad is highly available, still about 25% of calls go to dad. Okay. Overall, if you average across all these, you'd see that moms get about 59% of the calls. Okay, so I had this whole model that I showed you earlier. The model actually takes in information about, do you call mom, do you call dad, or do you call no one? So if I use all this information, so adding the green bars on top, which of course makes this figure harder to read, I can then try to figure out what's driving the inequality when there's no signal about who to call. But to your point, Ava, about the who's listed first, that really does matter. So let me just take a minute to pause and show you what happens here. So how to read this? Okay, so the reply to sender effect here, right? Because that's randomized too, which person is first, is the gray bars here. Okay, and the reply to sender effect is huge, essentially. So when there's no signal about who to call, the reply to sender effect is basically like driving 80% of who they call. They basically are like, oh, I'm going to call the first person here 80% of the time. That's it. Okay. And so that's kind of nice to know. Like, it's like nice to know that if you really wanted to push all the calls to one parent or the other, you could do that by simply always listing this person first, right? That may not be what a lot of households want. Like if you look at surveys of households, a lot of households want an interior solution. So it may not be great for a household that wants a 50-50 split, but if you're trying to have a stay-at-home dad, looks like there's a way to make that happen, right? It is very difficult to attain a 50-50 split. Exactly. So corner solutions are possible, but maybe not desired. And then I could show you here for the same thing for all the different messages. You'll notice that the gray bars are, slightly shorter in some of these. That kind of makes sense, right? Insofar as like, if I tell you, maybe on the far left-hand side here, you could look at the high male availability. If I tell you that dad is highly available, right? Even though dad might be listed first or second there, that's going to matter a little bit less than when I tell you no signal about it, because now you've given me some idea of who I should actually call in verbal, signal versus just listing the other person first. Okay. All right. So just in case you're curious about how school contact systems work, often they have this idea of like a primary contact, which of course leads to corner solutions. So my sort of suggestion, and I've been meaning, this is on my list of things to do too, is to talk to a bunch of these school systems and be like, is there some way we can make this so that someone could say, I want to be called on these days of the week, or I want to be called 50% of the time. But right now, most of these systems force one person to always be the primary contact, which leads to corner solutions, which households say they don't want. Okay. So we would maybe want to change these systems that the contact systems that these schools interact with. All right. So back to this idea of like going back to my model, like how much of this is driven by beliefs about responsiveness and how much of it is driven by other stuff. Okay. So, remember I had this model, remember I had these letters, the QRs, Fs minus the QRMs are going to tell me if decision makers believe that female parents are going to be more responsive. Indeed, they do. Okay. And the magnitude of that, this number doesn't really matter, is 0.0627 in our model, right? That number means nothing on its own, but it might mean something when I compare it to the magnitude of what other deterrents are contributing to this, right? So, when we're thinking about other deterrents from calling male versus female parents, we find that the decision makers believe that there are greater deterrents to calling male parents than female parents, and the magnitude of that is 0.536. Once again, 0.536 means nothing. What you might want to look at is 0.627 versus 0.536. You can see those are very similar. They are not statistically significantly different from each other, actually, in this setting. And so, if you believe our model, it says that both beliefs of responsiveness and other deterrents are but kind of equal mechanisms for why we're seeing this inequality in calling female parents more than male parents. All right. So what's driving that with my last few minutes, and then I'll open it up to discussion. Let me show you this. Okay, so here what I've done is basically look at proxies of gender norms. So for instance, the top one here is religious schools versus non-religious schools in our data set. And what I'm looking for here is there a bigger gap in religious schools versus non-religious schools for calling moms versus dads? The fact that this is well above the 0 point for religious schools means that there is a much larger inequality between calling moms versus dads for religious schools than there is for non-religious schools. And so that might be part of this driving this, right? That these traditional gender norms at religious schools are making these principals more likely to call moms versus dads, in spite of our messaging about dads being more available versus moms being more available. We also do a few other cuts. We look at more Republican counties versus less Republican counties in the US. We look at counties with a larger wage gap versus a smaller wage gap. Yeah, go for it, Vihetha.
Right. I was wondering on the previous slide where you showed the difference between the expectation of availability versus other deterrents. If you could, in very layman terms, give us a sense of where this number is coming from. Like, given your range of options of the emails and stuff, like where is this coming from? If you could
so what this is in the center area here, where it says no signal, we're basically trying to explain like why the blue bar and the orange bar are different heights in this center area here. Right. And what this comes from is that random utility model I showed you many slides back now. Because we in that random utility model, when I send you a signal about high or low female availability, so all these other bars surrounding on the left and the right hand side here, those proportions feed back into that utility function once it's updated and allow us to back out basically what we expect to be the size of the effect from messages about responsiveness, and then basically the size of the effect from everything else. Does that sort of clarify what's happening here? So the changes in the proportions on these other sides are the thing that is showing us these specific point estimates of these structural parameters.
Right. So you're trying to force your hand on the QF and RF part of it, and whatever still remains unexplained becomes the other part. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's just a catch-all. Yep. And then what I'm trying to tell you right now is maybe part of that catch-all is driven by traditional gender norms in religious versus non-religious schools, Republican counties, counties with larger wage gaps, more rural counties. And here you can see the more religious counties, this is not statistically significant, right? So we kind of, I don't think any one of these cuts is going to be particularly convincing on its own, but maybe all of them together sort of tell this story that part of this might be driven by these sort of traditional gender norms driving this stuff.
Laura, but I think it's a little tricky to like believe that it's the caller's idea that the mom should be more available, because you're also going to have a distribution of the moms that are going to be more likely to stay at home moms.
No, totally right. That's a
to-
feedback loop in these areas, right? So if I send my child to a religious school, I might also be signaling something about, the type of person I am. I agree.
And the distribution of stay-at-home moms might be much higher in that population.
Yes.
So again, it's the,
No, totally. I agree. Yeah. So this is not causal evidence that, this is sort of just like descriptively that might be part of it. I agree fully. All right. So just to get through 2 alternative mechanisms, we did do a version where we said everyone works full time. Everything looks about the same. And we did do a version where we said, we're especially interested in discussing school fees and other expenses. We thought that might push calls to dads. It does not. Looks about the same. Okay. So now this is perfect timing. We have like 8 minutes to discuss. Okay. So I'm just going to throw up all this stuff here and say that I would open it up to discussion about what we hope to have documented here, which is this sort of novel form of gender inequality and why we've given you some idea of why we think it's happening. And we think it does have long-term labor consequences. So please jump in. Let's talk.
So Laura, I have a quick question. So
Yes.
from what all you showed us, so what's the punchline?
So
If
I think
there's
the
a punch.
punchline
go
here is that female parents face more external demands than male parents. I don't think that's actually documented beforehand. Like, I think we know that part of that could be through selection, that like moms are saying, please call me. But now we know, even if mom says, don't call me, and dad doesn't say anything about calling me either, that external demand is still unequal. And so I think that's a novel thing to think about. And I think we want to think about how we can change either the norms of the beliefs of these decision makers or the systems that they interact with to make it easier for households to communicate what the actual allocation of demands they want from these external decision makers are. So that, I think, is the punchline for me.
Yeah. So one thing is about, as far as I understand about private schools and all that, but when it comes to public schools, do you think that where you live, whatever kind of is a driving force about, right? I mean, but the principals won't know where you are, right? Would
Yep.
they know that you're in that area, or is there any way to identify? I mean, not identify at least.
So are you asking about the idea that maybe in a more progressive area that a principal might be more likely to have less of an inequality? Yes, I think that's true. And I think we sort of showed that with the more Republican versus less Republican split beforehand. Yes, I think that's definitely possible.
Okay.
But the
thank
inequality
you.
still exists, by the way, even.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Elena, go for it.
Elena?
Yes, I really enjoyed the presentation. So I kept wondering, in that treatment where you said we both work full time, I wonder if you would have gotten different results if, for instance, you said the mom is a doctor or something like that. And I'm saying this because the only reason that when I get taken seriously in these kinds of situations is if I put doctor in front of my name, and I think everyone thinks that I'm a real doctor. So because even if we both work full time, there's, I mean, you're right. Like the system is like totally messed up, and they always think that women are just sitting at home, or even when they're working full time, that their job is less, important compared to men. So
yes, yeah, I think you're totally right, and I think that's something in follow-on research we kind of want to think about, like how can you signal effectively what you want to signal even more so. It could be through something like saying you're a doctor, or you're a surgeon. Like I'm in surgery, you can't call me out. Yeah. Klaus.
Well, I have a problem with respect to competence. A priori, one may think when you call from outside that the mother is more competent. It would be better. Let's say if the kid is in school, and the teacher, for instance, knows who is the competent person to talk to. Then if you would control randomly over whether there are differences. So at the moment from the email, there is no clue. So you just take what you statistically know from the population in the United States or in the region or whatever. And isn't this a little bit misleading?
So I think to try to get at that, and I will say, I don't know if we've done this perfectly, is we did, I'm just trying to find the messages real quickly. We add in this question, this thing about both those of us wanting to be the type of decision we both want to be involved in equally. So here we were trying to signal this idea that like we are both capable and, you know, able to make this decision. We don't see a lot of difference in the response when we add that sentence in or don't add that in. But the idea here is to try to signal that both parents are capable in this setting. So something to keep in mind. Now, have I been able to fully shut down the idea that on average, maybe people think men are less capable than women in this setting? I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, when you initially showed this, I just thought it's a weird sentence in the sense, not in your experiment, but in general, if you are right, if I am a principal reading this letter, I will pretty much ignore that sentence. I mean, what does it mean? You know, it's like, yeah, of course you are. It's your, you know, it's like, you know, my prior was that it wasn't going to add anything at all.
And it doesn't really change things. It's true. You know, and I think we thought really carefully about how we could try to manipulate beliefs about how competent the person is in a natural way. And truthfully, we just didn't come up, you know, this is as good as we thought we could. We were worried it would look unnatural. And there you might think that the callback rate would be different if it was like felt unnatural, and the callback rate is very similar. So I don't think it was harmful to include this in here, but I don't think by any means it's a silver bullet for hitting this idea of like signaling competence, you know, of that parent. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask two questions? Do we have time?
Yeah, sure. Gulfi, go ahead.
So the first question, or it's a remark rather, is that there are some studies from Scandinavia that show that the gender division of labor it goes from generation to generation. There's one I remember from Denmark, and that's a country where you have all the institutions facilitate gender equality, you know, all the kindergartens and maternity leaves and paternity leaves and so forth. Yet the women who come from families where the mothers did a disproportionate share of the housework also tend to do the same thing. So values go in families. So when we talk about traditional values, I mean, they go in families. So there are people whose family background make the man do more of the money earning activities, income earning activities, and so forth. And which leads to the question, is this a problem? You know, if you have families with traditional values where there's this division of labor, is it a problem in any sense? Should we be concerned? And we also have studies that show that second generation Americans, the labor market participation of women reflect the values of the home country of their parents, right? So values are sticky and they go in families. So that's what we know. But is this a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a larger question.
Inequality, is this an inequality that needs to be corrected?
Yeah, I think that's a larger question about like what is, you know, maybe in many countries, not so much in the US, but in many countries, we're trying to increase the labor force participation of women simply because we have labor shortages. I think that's a much bigger question to me. To me, I think the sort of proof of concept question here is like, is there external demands on mothers more so than fathers for households that don't want that, right? You know, like if that inequality exists for a household that's signaling that they do not like that, can we correct that? And I think that to me is something that we would like to correct. But, you know, overall, is there a problem with households that elect to have a more traditional gender norm split? That I think is a much larger question outside the scope of what I'm doing here. Yeah. Janice.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your presentation. I was wondering if you thought about the signal of both Roy and Erica having the same last name or being Miller family net as a sort of signal that they are more of a traditional family, and whether or not looking at having a different name for Erica might have looked at different responses.
Yeah, I think if anything, what we've done here is like make it so that you would expect it to be a more traditional family because they have a, you know, say shared last name. That is much more common in the US, so it's also just sort of an external validity thing here as well. We did run also versions where we set it from a family email address and then just put down the names of each person. And that doesn't change much as well, but I think that's an open question. I agree that would be about like, you know, how would these expand if we had different last names? Yeah.
But what if you had if you signaled, whether it's traditional values or progressive values, like if you had there are parents who indicate that they are members of some association, like Republican Party, doesn't have to be that, but or some other party.
Well, I mean, saying they have different last names is definitely a good one that Janice just suggested, right? Having different last names is a signal of being less traditional in the U.S. So that's a good follow-on thought that we haven't explored so far. I realize we're at 9:01, so I want to be respectful of people's time. So I'm happy to stick around, but I'll say thank you to everybody who came. And if anyone wants to stick around for a few minutes, I don't know if we have the Zoom room, but I'm happy to stick around. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura, for a great presentation. And yeah, if you have any last minute question, another minute or so, but otherwise we'll stop here.
Yeah, I just had the quick thing. I think a lot of the pushback might, or maybe not pushback, but interest for me would be whether it is driven by the principal, right? Who is it that's calling back? Mm-hmm. So knowing the age range, I think getting an army of undergrads on scouring the websites.
We're thinking about it. Yeah. We do know the gender. We do know the gender of the principal, and you can check the appendix for that. There's not much on the. I mean, we do the gender by the name because we know their name, and that's an easy thing to run through in our script. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's super cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll stop here. Thanks very much again, Laura.
Okay.
See you all. Bye.